All right, let's just talk a little bit about what we have to be aware of for tomorrow. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this is that I think you guys are in very, very good shape because you've been basically doing a lot of stuff with Express and with Angular. Angular, I've really less of a concern because you did the Angular assessment already, but we'll go over that too. So there's nothing that's really going to be, I put together a couple of notes of some things. These are all things you should know about already, but let's start, and we'll start really to some degree from the order that you'll probably end up doing these things on the assessment. I'm also going to be late tomorrow. I get another board meeting, so someone else is going to start you guys off. Dan's going to start it off. And so again, it's going to follow the sort of same format that you guys have seen before with, test first development.
Is there going to be a party in here again? Because that was very disturbing.
You know what? It was a little disturbing. I doubt it. I think that was kind of isolated, but I don't know. But you know what? I'll slack Gabby and ask her about it. It was a little bit. Agreed. Yeah, I wasn't happy. So this order again, and by the way, just as an idea, again, you're not writing the test specs. You're following the test specs. Some of the syntax for the test might look a little bit different that you might not have seen before. But again, there's ways of actually going in and grabbing a schema and seeing, hey, look, does the schema that I'm looking for adhere to the structure that I need it to be in order to pass the test? So again, you're going to sort of just follow the specs. The other thing is that you don't have to necessarily start from the server side. You could start from the Angular side and go that way. It doesn't really matter. They're really kind of independent of each other unless you actually want to start up the application, and you don't have to start up the application to get the test to run. I found it sort of helpful to go from the back end. One thing that I just wanted to pop up here, one thing that I did notice on the tests is that if we end up running this Mocha command and we say, hey, look, Mocha /test/server, and again, this is going to be all in the README file. It'll end up running the tests. Again, I'm not sure why it wasn't like this on the repo, but it won't continually run the tests as you get things to pass. I like to continually run them. So if you decide you want to do that, you could use NodeMon. But if you do it, just realize if you go and you end up using NodeMon, then you're just going to want to access Mocha through the Node modules. So the way that you don't have to do this, you could kill the test and restart it, but you could write down this command if you want to, basically, which is saying NodeMon, when anything changes, I want to basically rerun these tests. I don't know why it doesn't work if you say NodeMon Mocha /test/server. It doesn't have what would be considered the Mocha CLI. It doesn't have access to it, but you could always get access to any of these things that you installed by just going through the Node modules directory, and some of these executables are stored in that .bin folder. You don't need to do it, but it'll make your testing go a little bit faster. So when we start to talk about Mongoose, the things that we have covered, things that are important, is obviously the first thing that you do is declare your schema, right? Your schema is going to be your structure. When you end up declaring your schema, things to sort of be aware of is that when you define a property of a schema, you have the ability to specify what the type is. You have the ability to specify whether or not it's required. You have the ability to specify default value. So for instance here, if we had this schema, I always like to just sort of think about it with these kind of silly examples. If we had this example of a bar schema where we've got a type, the type is going to be a number, we give it a default value, so it'll have a default value, we could end up making it required, right? So that's basically how you end up setting anything other than, the most simplistic way would be actually to just say foo : number. But then you don't really have any control over the schema. Once you want to start giving default values or required, that you have the key in your value, instead of it just being a type, is going to be this object, which will include the type, okay? this you've seen a million times already before, and you can always go and look up the Mongoose documentation if you have to, right? That's perfectly legitimate. The one thing that we do here is that when we want to use references, we want to store things as an object ID. The key thing is to specify that the type is going to be an object ID. And also, if it's an object ID, what model it's referring to. So this would assume that somewhere, at some point, we've also defined a buzz model, and we've also defined a user model. And we know that when we want to create a Mongoose model, right, Mongoose model bar schema is going to give us the schema for that. So this is, again, stuff we've done a bunch of different times. Once you know how to define a schema, and again, the test will guide you through what that schema is supposed to look like. Once you know how to define a schema, you also have to understand how statics and methods work. So statics are when you're looking at the big model. When you're looking at this, if you have this bar object, right, or if you said Mongoose model bar without the schema, then you could basically add methods to it. So here's a kind of a silly example. Find all bars with foo equals 5, right? Since this is on the statics property, this is going to refer to our big bar model, right? And so if I end up doing this and I call find, I could put in foo is equal to 5, and that'll give me a promise, which will give me all of the bar values that have a foo value of 5, right? So statics, you've probably done it a bunch of times in stack stores. Basically, a pretty common thing is you're running the same queries a lot, where you're populating things maybe. Maybe you end up doing that with or you're running the same query. Maybe you put a static method. You could think of in stack store, maybe if you had a product model, it would be something like a static method called products in stock or something like that. So you don't have to keep on going and writing that query, right? It's basically isolating things in the model. If you actually want to put methods on, give functionality to the little model, the instances of the models, okay? When you're actually getting a bar, you end up doing that through the methods property. So this tends to get used for querying. This can get used for any number of things, right? You've seen this before. The point that I want to go over here is that, again, this depends on what the method is going to do. This is a method, and what this method does is it takes the value of bar and it increases it by some value. If you pass in a value, it'll increase it by that value, okay? If you don't pass in a value, it'll end up incrementing it by 1. Really should talk up here. These guys can hear me. So here in this static method, in this method here, what's actually important is that these methods could do anything. If we wanted to do this method and then save the value, save the object, we could do that, okay? We could also return whatever we want to from these methods, okay? If I want to return, I can return whatever I want to from here, right? I could return that if I want to, okay? Just be aware of what the method is supposed to be returning, right? So you have the ability, there's nothing written in stone as to say what these things end up returning. But you're in full control of that, and again, just sort of follow the test and see what these methods are supposed to do.
Can you go on that once more? I'm not sure I was really following the difference between a static and a method. So
Static is on the big model,
right.
okay? Methods are on an instance of the model. So if I ended up doing, let's say I ended up doing a this.find foo, and I put a then here, and this gave me foos. But one of the things I could do here, I could say if foos.length is greater than 0, foos 0 dot increase, I mean, these are really bars, but increase foo by 10. Let me actually rename this. So this find, these are actually going to be bars. If bars.length is greater than 0. So methods are on the instances of what I end up getting back. You can think of, if you thought of a regular database, you could think of methods as being, you can think of the static methods as being something on a table, even though that doesn't really exist, and maybe the methods on a row of data. Does that sort of make sense a little bit?
Yeah, so just to compare, like SQLize, the method is what static.
SQLize has two different things. SQLize sets it up differently. SQLize actually has something called class methods and something called instance methods. So their class methods are statics and their instance methods are methods. Yeah, it's a little bit of a weird naming convention. It's a good question. It's a good question.
Can I take a shot at trying to explain the difference?
Sure.
I'm not sure that I 100% understand it, but the way I see it is that statics are like find by ID, for example, would be a static, although it's obviously built in and stuff like that.
That's right. Find by is an existing static on the model. That's right.
Versus a method would be something that deals with one specific row within the collection.
That's correct.
It's going to, I don't know, rename it or add quantity or whatever.
So right.
It's going to make a change versus statics are going to return a subset of data.
Right. Right. Yeah, I mean, and don't forget, statics can do anything. They tend to be used a lot for querying, but they could also be used for something like, I mean, if you think of our example with orders, like maybe we have a static method called, or if we had a cart model or something along those lines. You know, maybe we have a static method called update order. And maybe there's a bunch of things that we do when we end up updating an order. Other ways to do the same thing. I mean, you could use pre-hooks and post-hooks and that sort of thing. But I mean, I had some business logic where everything was an order, even my cart. So I would sort of know what I needed to do by looking at the status or seeing how the status had changed and put my logic in. It allows you to basically encapsulate logic. And you're right, there are built-in static methods, and you have the ability to wrap around. Very commonly, you're wrapping around those other static methods or other static methods that you ended up creating, right? So, I mean, you could think of what would be like yeah, I mean, I think it works best when you're sort of thinking about querying, I think, when you sort of think about those static methods. I can think of other ones like, you know, let's say you had a product and you had some method called find related products. Well, that could be a static method if you ended up passing in a product, right? And you could find sort of related products by category or price or something like that. Or you could make it a method on the product itself and say, hey, look, product, you know who you are, find the related, find related items and that sort of thing. But again, big model, little model, I think that's the best way to think about it.
I'm trying to remember which instances I ran into when I was working on the static store. At some point I had to use like this.constructor.find. I'm trying to remember what that was.
You know, you might. I mean, if you're in, the only thing that I could sort of, I usually don't have to do that.
Yeah.
The only thing that I could think of where you might end up doing that is that maybe you're in a method here, and you want to end up using the model itself. You know, I could,
Yeah.
but you know, if you wanted to use the model itself, don't forget you could. There's other ways to do it too. I mean, I think that there is. I think you're right. I think there is some like, you know, this dot constructor or whatever. But I think don't forget you also have this variable called bar here. Okay, you could just do bar, or frankly, if you wanted to get the big model again. Any number of ways to do that, right? Mongoose makes it a little bit easier because it's basically, you know, has this method in Mongoose says, give me the name of the model and I'll get the model.
Yeah, I think I was trying to do like a product.find, uppercase product.find
Yeah.
inside
An instance.
Inside a method or a static.
But that would work, you know, that could work from here, right? You could do bar, and bars at this point when you go in here, right? Bar is going to be defined.
Yeah.
When this ends up getting called, right? Because this is a function that we're defining. So anyway, the other thing that you should be aware of is that you have the ability to populate. So when you do have these properties that are referencing other objects, you can populate them. It's also important, and I am sure that you guys did this with StackStore, that you would populate multiple. We call these paths, by the way. That's what they end up getting called in SQLize. They might be called paths too, but definitely in Mongoose they're called paths on the object. So like if we wanted to populate that user path, we could do that. But if we had this schema that has the user path and also has the buzz paths, and you wanted to populate both of them, you could do it like this. I'm sure you guys had at some point had to do that, I would think, with StackStore, because there was probably multiple things that you had to populate, but that'll end up populating both of those paths. Okay, that's about the extent that you have to sort of know about dealing with Mongoose. Again, dealing with the references and that sort of thing. So the second part of this is also, making sure that you're still, again, and you've worked on this in StackStore, that you have a comfort zone with using, routers. So again, the rationale for using the routers is basically to separate things out. You don't want to have one big gigantic file with all of your routes in there. And so the basis for these things is requiring express and calling the router method, making sure you end up exporting that router, and then basically adding methods to the router. So again, the router is obviously where you're going to end up using your model, right? Because if you don't have some kind of Mongoose model on a router, then you could get data back, but you're not going to be getting it back from your database. The same way that we often think about our controllers in Angular rely on our factories, right? So in our in Express, our routes end up relying on our models. So, in this case, we could set up a model. Again, stuff you've seen a bunch of times in StackStore, but in this case, we're using our model. We're using find by ID. And in fact, I don't really need this return here. This doesn't buy me anything. I'm not doing anything with this promise, but when this promise ends up getting resolved, I'm going to end up sending it. The other thing that I wanted you to see here, just in case you didn't do it too much in StackStore, you have the ability to set a status. You don't have to. This would be default status. This, by default, it's going to end up sending back a 200 status. But if you wanted to modify the status, you could set the status and then end up sending whatever you want to send back. Again, these aren't things that you couldn't look up, but something you should just be aware of.
What's the difference between using send there? What's the difference between using that and JSON?
If it's an object, it'll actually just send it back as JSON data. Yeah, as far as I see, it's kind of redundant.
Now the body parser, does that parse inbound messages or outbound?
It's only inbound.
It's only inbound.
Mm-hmm. Because there's no body really going outbound, right? There's nothing getting parsed going outbound.
Right, exactly.
Something's getting stringified going outbound. So internally, what probably happens here, my guess, and I think that this might have been something that has been changed, is that if you probably looked at that send method, I think that send method is probably saying, hey, look, is this a string? If this is a string, I'm just going to send it out. But if it's a object, I'm going to stringify it. My guess.
So is it better practice to use send?
I use send. I don't know. It's a good question. You could look it up on Stack Overflow. I don't know. I see this, although in a lot of the workshops here, I see the JSON, but I don't know what it buys you really one way or the other. I mean, if you're not getting any, you're definitely getting JSON back from here. It's got to be, it's an object that you're getting back from there. So it's automatically going to go back as JSON. It's not like the product that you're going to get back here is going to be a string. It's going to be an object. So, and again, you could put an error handler here just in case you have an error. And the other takeaway here is that when you end up sort of utilizing this router, you end up utilizing it very often. You'll end up utilizing it by saying, in another file, hey, look, app.use/API, this router. And in essence, what it does is the way that the terminology that I like to use is it's mounting this router on this path. And as a result of that, you'll have a route where our route was just get with a slash products ID. It would be slash API slash products and slash, whatever the ID was, right? And again, things you've seen a bunch of times. This is nothing that's new. It's about the extent of, I think, really, again, comfort zone with Mongoose, which I'm pretty sure if you guys don't have, you get tripped up by syntax. Look it up in documentation. You don't have to memorize everything. If you have a question about the express router, again, you could look that up in documentation. That's not a big thing, one way or the other either. You've seen it enough times. So the once we go from there, right? Let's also go sort of in the order. So again, whether you do the front end or the back end, whether you do the front end first or the back end first, that doesn't really matter. But when you do end up doing the back end, you're going to want to start with your models and go to your routes. When you end up doing the front end, you're going to want to start with your factories, because the factories, the same way, again, it's a nice analogy. The same way that the routers are dependent on the models, the controllers are dependent on the factories, right? So, and again, the whole idea of that is sort of separation of concerns. You don't want to have this mammoth file with everything going on in it. So if we end up looking at our, for the most part, when we think about factories, again, factories don't have to do this, but very often we use our factories to basically interact with the back end, right? If we were going to take a guess and say, hey, look, I've got $ HTTP objects that are being injected in my application, we could probably make a pretty good guess that they're probably being injected into factories, okay? Because this is where we end up making calls to our server. The other thing is that factories are singletons. Factories end up returning objects. And not that you have to sort of know all that stuff, but when you think of factories and when you're writing a factory, I think you need to think about returning an object, which is a little bit different than a controller, which will get instantiated every time the controller gets instantiated.
Now, on that factor, do you have to inject $HTTP?
Yes.
Thank you. Yes, yeah. Oh. All right. You're right. I did this on the car on the way over. You're right. That's right. That's it's very important. In fact, yeah, I remember someone had a real problem on the assessments. They forgot to do that. That's important. Okay. And you'll see that because, if nothing ends up because very often when you end up using these factories, you'll put a then on something. And if you don't end up returning something, it'll tell you, hey, look, this, you need me, Chris? Oh. So, yeah, so, right, you have to make sure that you return that the HTTP or whatever else ends up getting injected. And again, the big thing here is that when you end up using HTTP, you're making an AJAX request, but you're getting back more than the data. You're getting back a response, which has headers, status, a bunch of other things, like a regular HTTP request or response gets back. So here, we're usually interested in the data, and this is where we would end up sending back not the response, but the response.data, okay? Again, this tripped you up a couple of times. You could usually, find this out pretty easily. But the factories are always nice because they're actually usually pretty easy to test. You've sort of seen these tests where when you end up testing out Angular factories, that these calls to the server end up getting mocked out. And again, you've seen these tests before. Writing them can be sometimes a little bit of a challenge, but implementing the code that gets them to work is going to be a little bit easier. So, one level up from the factories, right? We think about our controllers. So, here's our controller. And again, this would not be uncommon, although, so in this case, we're using our widget factory. We're calling fetch all. We're getting our widgets. Again, we don't have to do anything. One of the reasons why we use the factory is that, we don't have to worry about making an HTTP call and, getting the data from the response, right? We're actually just getting the widgets back. So again, if there was more work that was being done, just to sort of throw this out, if there was some massaging that was going on in here, or maybe we were creating objects in here, we could do that. And the controller, when we think about the controller, we like to think thin, right? We want to have thin controllers, fat factories, right? Same way we want to have thin routes and fat models, full models, full factories. Okay. So the other thing here is that don't go crazy with the scope. Only put on the scope what you need to put on the scope. So this would be common if you had a form and you were inserting a widget, right? Maybe on your button click, you would call insert widget. And maybe if you were specifying a widget that was on the scope, this would end up calling the factory to go ahead and insert the widget. So very often the only things that you put on the scope are gonna be things that you end up needing in your template. It's real, sometimes common, people just, whenever there's a function that they're using in their controller, they'll immediately put it on the scope. And you've seen, I've commented on your code when I end up seeing that. Only if it needs to be on the scope do you end up putting it on scope. The only time it needs to be on the scope is if it's accessed in the template itself, okay? So again, that you've ended up seeing a bunch of times. By the way, what's another way that maybe we could get widgets in here? So if we were using our UI router, right, then we would end up setting up a route or what we call a state on our router, and we call resolve, and we would use the widgets factory in that resolve, and we would end up getting the widgets. And in that case, right, it would look more like this.
You still use the factory if you're not
You might use the
invoking it in the controller or invoking it.
No, you don't. But you might use it because maybe in that same controller, you're also going to use the factory to insert something, right? And that you can't resolve. So in that case, you would end up needing the factory. But if it was just basically like a read-only, just showing stuff, then you wouldn't need it.
So if you set up a directive and instead of doing the link, you do a controller and you're just using controlling something else, and you do the resolve.
I don't think you could do the resolve that way, because I think you could only do the resolve with the routes. So it would have to be, I think it would have to be one level high. Yeah, so the directive doesn't have any concept of resolve. You could pass data into the directive, and maybe that data was resolved from something. But in and of itself, the thing is with the directive, let me take this out. So yeah, and so the thing really with the directive, like when we think about the directive, we're thinking about display, right? We're thinking about, hey, look, I've got some display, I've got a template, and I've got data, and I want to isolate that, okay? So sort of a common thing is that, maybe you have a controller which is looping over a list of items, but maybe for each item you have a directive in terms of how you want to show that item. So like if we think about StackStore, the StackStore had all that stuff that was going on. If we're showing a list of products, then maybe we have you got somewhere to go, John? Oh. Remember that debate? Someone looked at their watch. It wasn't good. So no, so you'll see that, right? You'll see that again. It gives you this whole idea of isolation, so that you don't have this, again, you don't have this template that you have to sort of dig through and say where's this product being used. But more important than that, it can separate things out, but it could also isolate it if you wanted to. Someone was actually talking about this in the review where they used the product directive on the admin side, and they also used it on the front end. And you have that reusability.
So if you have something that's like a little widget or whatever on the screen that's like highly functional, and it needs to communicate back and forth with different controllers and scope, do you not want to put that in the directive?
No, I think you could put it in a directive. I think that would be totally fine. I mean, the directive is more of, again, the directives are really front-end widgets. That's what they end up coming down to, being able to isolate them, right? They're going to result in HTML.
And they're getting their data from the scope that they reside in.
Yeah, they're getting the data. So, like, let's take a silly example. Let's say that you had, let's think of one. Let's say that you have different places where you're inserting a product in your application, right? So, one of the things you could do is that, or let's even make it even a little bit better. Let's say you have different places where you're editing a product in your application. So you can have this widget called a product editor or something like that, a directive, where you pass a product in there. But maybe when the save button is clicked, right? You don't want to do the same thing every time you end up using the directive. Maybe you're on an admin page, you want to do something different. So what you could end up doing there, we didn't do all that much of it, I have to say. I mean, I did it on I think on some of the Northwind stuff, is to basically pass a method into the directive. Something like, on save or something like that. And this way, whoever is using that directive could control what happens when something ends up getting saved. Maybe in one place, they want to display a toast message. Maybe in another place, they want to do something with the cart. I mean, who the hell knows, right? But that gives you that sort of functionality. So that gives you both the ability, I mean, what it really ends up coming down to is the ability to sort of go down and then go back up, right? So when you pass in a method, the only way you could really go back up is either by, emitting some event or calling some method. That's the only way that you could do it. It's actually kind of interesting. I've been looking at React a little bit lately, where, and again, I'm just sort of touching it, but basically it feels very, very directive-like. I mean, everything in React is doesn't give you a ton of functionality, but the whole idea is sort of separating things out into these components that feel like directives, but there's no real two-way data binder. They have this architecture that sort of forces you to sort of go in this one direction data flow. I mean, at some point I'll do a simple, when I feel a little bit more comfortable with it, I'll do a demo, but you'll see the similarities between that stuff. At first, when you look at it, you're like, boy, this feels totally crazy and totally different. But then when you start to look at it a little bit more, you're like, oh yeah, that kind of feels similar to the way directives feel. Less like controllers and factories, but more like directives. Then there are other things in terms of how you end up getting the data and what constitutes factories and that sort of thing. But there's not this sort of like, you have to be very implicit about their whole things. You have to be very implicit when things change. You have to be specific and say, this changed, and it'll go through and sort of figure out how it has to modify the DOM. But that's just a whole other story. So in essence, when we end up thinking about these directives, some of the, we think about this directive definition object. This is wrong too. With the directive, we return a directive definition object. It's going to look like this. And I don't know how to indent on this thing. Really should figure that out. Anyway, this is going to be internal to this. Let me just add this over. So the one thing with the directive is to specify how it ends up getting used, right? Whether you want it to be used as an element, whether you want it to be used as an attribute. I missed something here. Link. Yeah, this is going to be a function. I think I've got. Yeah, that looks a little bit better. So this is a directive definition object which specifies, how this is going to end up getting used. You have to specify a template URL. Usually, you have a scope, because although you don't have a scope, and again, we're going back to ancient history, but when I first showed you guys directives, we literally took a bunch of stuff that was in a template and pasted it into a directive, and it worked totally fine because it just inherited the parent scope. But very often you want to pass things in, so things get passed into directives from attributes. So here, when this ends up getting used, we would expect that this directive is gonna look something like this. It's being used, it's going to be, right, the Bob case, and we would pass in a widget, and assuming that we have a widget on the scope, right, we could do something like that. Right, so in terms of the functionality for the directive, you could either use link or you could use controller. If you use link, remember things are not injected into link. The first parameter is going to be the scope. And very often, maybe you'll end up putting something on the scope. Maybe there's some action that's inside the, if this template, let's say, had a button in it and had an ng click on it, this is where we would end up doing the scope for do something. So, maybe this template would, maybe look like a div and ng click equals do something, right? And maybe we would just display the widget, and let's say the widget had a name. Right, so that's what the template URL would end up looking like. By the way, there's nothing to do with the assessment. We can just put this in line if we wanted to, too. So again, the sort of things for the, understanding that by the way, the factories and the directives look pretty similar. In fact, what ends up happening with both the first time that these end up getting used, right, it ends up using this directive definition object anytime it ends up creating one of these directives. The same way with the factory ends up using that singleton object that we end up passing back. And there are other attributes, right? It's SAE, I think. Is it SAE? Attributes. Damn it. How did I do that? SAE, which is a fraternity or something. So this is going to be element and attributes, right? We don't really have to do all that much with that. And again, if you did want to inject something in a directive, you could always put it up here. So, maybe there's a delete button in here, and we tell the widget factory to go and delete the element or something like that. That's about the extent. Does everyone feel pretty comfortable with this at this point? I hope, right? I mean,
The element and attribute in the function of the link. What's element and attribute?
the element is the actual element that's in the DOM. So you could have access to this, the element itself, right, is some tag. And you could have access to that element. Usually you'll end up doing this for something where you want to add some functionality like jQuery functionality or something like that. You could also grab the attributes too. If you looked at the attributes are just going to look like key value pairs, right?
So the element meaning like you want to make it active or something like that.
I guess so. I guess if you wanted to, I'm not exactly sure. I'd have to give you an example of how we would end up using that.
If you want to manipulate the DOM in some way, if you want to change the class on something, like that's all built in. Like Angular has jQuery Lite built in. So
you could do it. I just don't see, I'm sure there were some things that we did where like implementing a double click directive or something like that. You might want to get at the element itself and actually track add the double click or blur or something along those lines.
And in this case, the element we're talking about is widget dash.
Yeah, the element itself in this case would be this guy here. Yeah.
And then the attributes are, we say, widget.
That's exactly right. And those are treated like strings. I mean, again, when we end up, when they're sort of these living directives, it's a little bit different because those things turn out to be objects that get passed in there. But here they're just string value pairs.
So in that case there, if widget equals widget, could you have widget equals and then that be an object instead, or you pass an object in instead?
Well, when you end up, in terms of the DOM, attributes are key value pairs, they're strings. They're always strings. So you can't pass it, you can't really pass it that way.
How would you pass in an object then in this case?
We're doing it.
So
We're passing in the widget that's on the parent scope.
Okay, because that's the equal.
That's the equal, that's right. That's
And
right.
then when you want to use it, you just do something with scope.widget. That's it.
That's exactly right. And you have it because it's on the scope. I mean, let's say theoretically, if you wanted to, you could add other things to the scope. I mean, maybe when you go into this link, maybe based upon the the values of the widget. Maybe there's some other values you're using in the directive and some other factory that you're calling. You could do it. I mean, you have every right to do it, and you could add those to the scope as well. It's not like, there are things that you're letting users pass into the scope, but you could add things to the scope the same way we added a method here to the scope. Right? It's our scope. We can do whatever we want to it. The question is, what are we giving, might use the word consumer. What are we giving the consumer the ability to pass in?
So now I'm a little lost in the attributes. So scope is an object, widget equals whatever. We specify that widget equals widget.
Okay.
So that's all on scope, using that scope.
That's the scope. When we get down here, that scope will have the widget on it that was passed in here.
Got it. So then what is the attribute?
The attributes, I mean, if I decided to have, if I had other attributes that were here, and I looked at what these attributes were, I would see key value pairs. I would see there's an attribute widget that has the string widget in it. I would see the attribute foo has the value bar in it.
Which wasn't necessarily from the scope. Just something.
Wasn't from the scope. It was just something that I passed in. Any other directive questions?
Are we going to be using the other scope elements like that?
You might, can't say for sure, right? So the add value is basically when you're passing something that is, like an example of that would be, so, one way you might see this is like if we had title, and we wanted to pass it in as a string. But then if we went down here, we would pass in title, hello widget, right? So that ends up getting passed in as a string here. If we put the equal sign here, so you can sort of think about it in the reverse. This wouldn't make sense. If we put the equal sign here, it's going to look for an object on the scope called hello space widget, which is not going to make all that much sense. So this will end up just passing this in as a string. And the other one is if you have methods that get passed in, those get passed in as a ampersand. Why do I not want to call that an ampersand? Because I think the other thing looks like an ampersand. But that is an ampersand, right?
Agreed.
Awful, right?
So equal sign says.
Equal sign says pass the object. Look for an object on the scope with that name.
So like, let's say you're hypothetically on a form, you could then pass that ng model into that equal symbol and operate on whatever ng model as part of it.
Yeah, I mean, it basically gives you the ability to pass objects in, and you have that two-way data binding that's going on. Yeah.
And then do something. That ampersand would essentially be like, let's say.
Yeah, so here, yeah, this would be something like, so here, now again, since this is a camel case, and attributes are supposed to be kebab case, do something would be some method, whatever. I have to say, I have to say in this, focused on the ampersand. I know we ended up covering it, so I wouldn't worry about it too much.
Just one thing about attributes and directives, it has to be kebab case. Like the case is very important. If you try a camel case, it's not going to recognize it.
It won't recognize. That's right. It's got to be kebab case.
Yeah. I've run into that.
Sure. I mean, and one of the ways you always see that when you're coding is that you'll end up seeing that you put this directive in, you don't see any errors, but you don't see anything showing up. And as a result of it saying, hey, look, the browser looks at it and says, boy, it's a very nice tag. I just don't know what the hell it is, right? So the last sort of part of this is that, you have the ability to use the state. So we've ended up, using the state provider. Again, we could sort of give an example of a state provider as well, but, when you end up configuring your state, right, you'll end up doing that in a config command that you can end up using your state provider to define your states. And in your, very often in your controllers, you'll do something like, hey, look, I just inserted this object. Let me go to the detail view. In which case you say, hey, look, state.go, here's the name of my state, and here's a hash of the parameters for my state. So this would probably correspond to a state where you had a URL that looked something like this. And what this would do is that this would actually change the location to /widget/bar, because bar would get substituted for foo over here, right? And I can show this too, but this you've seen a billion times, is that app.config function state provider. And so we're going to say, state provider dot state. And so in our example here, if we said this is going to be the widget detail state, right, then this object becomes the sort of configuration object for that state. So we would have things like a URL, which in our case would be widget. More than likely, it's going to be ID, probably. But again, I just wanted to show you that you could pass anything you wanted to here. But, we keep it consistent. We'll say widget.foo. We could say that we've got a template or a template URL, right? Right, and then, maybe you have a controller that you can put in here. But more important, right, is you're probably going to you might have a resolve that's here. And you know what? I made the mistake, right? Whenever we remember the last review, when you think of resolve, think of an object. Right? Hopefully you heard that in your sleep at some point. But here, if we wanted to basically pass in, the widget to our controller, we could do something like this. And this would look like, widget return widget factory find by ID. And this would be something like, state params dot, I'm going to change this to ID because it's driving me crazy. Right, and so then you would have something like that. And again, in your resolve, you could inject your widget factory. You could have your controller set up, have your controller do whatever it wants to do. But in essence, you're controlling the state of your application. It allows you to do sort of deep linking in your application, so your URL is indicative of what someone is looking at on the page. That's really what that's all about.
You need to inject state parameters.
Yes, thank you. You guys are on the ball tonight.
I had good luck with, on this, I also used params. You can declare a params object.
Okay.
And I passed an object into this, a needed object into the state. And just did it, in the HTML, when I was in the view.
Sure. You could do that.
Yeah, and it worked real good. Like I needed to pass the categories object in, and then so it came into params, and then you resolved it down below in resolve.
Okay.
So it's kind of
I've seen that. So where it's actually not doing anything asynchronous, you're just passing the value back.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because I already had it. I started thinking, I said, wait a minute, I can cut down on some of my.
Cut down on actually putting this. That's right. Cut down on the parameters that would be coming into the controller.
Yeah. So it's like, if it's one less HTTP call, I don't have to hit the factory one more time. I already have the thing I want.
Right.
In this view, while I'm going to the other view, just go ahead and pass the object in.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Oh,
I did that a lot in
I didn't think about that.
So you just put it in, so widget function, and you just have the object.
Yeah, it's like, right, it could be, you can just like add a line for URL and a line for template URL. There's another line called params.
Okay.
And then you can just define whatever you want. You could have like, you could have a param called product. And then what I did was I made it an empty object, it's just like a placeholder.
Yeah.
And then so on the HTML, when somebody called this state, you know, you do what is it, UISREF,
Right.
you go UISREF widget detail, comma, and then you have an object where you pass in the params in, you know, and I have.
I will tell you what concerns me a little bit with that.
Yeah.
I think it works when they're going from a state where you have that object to another state.
Mhm.
I don't think it works if you end up doing a deep linking. So if someone was to do a hard reload, I don't think you're going to have that product.
Yeah, I think what I ended up doing was I ran into that, and I actually put in logic that said, hey, that object didn't come in, go ahead and get it from the factory.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but you know, you're right, yeah, it adds a layer of complexity, because if it didn't come in.
I see exactly what you're saying. I see what you're saying. You're saying, hey, look, if I made this call already for this object, right, and I want to pass this into something else, why make that call again? It's interesting. Any number of ways to handle it. You know, what's kind of, well, you could also take a look at JS Data does things like puts in some caching already, like some built-in
Yes,
caching, and it says, it assumes that the data, you know, you have to be careful. You have to, you know, clear the cache when you need to clear it. But sometimes you could also, you know, cache things in your application as well. I mean, if you have that product, you could end up putting it on some factory somewhere and then grabbing it from that factory. And if you don't have it, all kinds of things you could do. Usually, I think the added complexity, I think in the end, unless there's some reason that I say, like, you know, that extra call is really going to slow me down, I'll just assume that this just has to work on a hard reload and deal with it from there.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's about the extent for the Angular stuff. Now, I wanted to also just talk about some other stuff that you haven't seen in a while. And the other thing is that when you do the assessment, and you'll read this when you do it, again, there's basically like 3 parts. There's going to be your server-side part. There's going to be your Angular part. Both of these are common, although you've done them separately before. But there's also going to be some functional programming that's unrelated to the Angular, unrelated to the Express stuff. I would save that for last. Yeah, I would do that last. It's kind of fun to do, but a couple of things that you should be aware of and that you should be able to do, and maybe I'll just pop up a JS bin just so we can see this. So if you forgot it already, know the difference between doing, you know, how call works and how apply works. And let's actually just test this out. So let's see if I can do this on the fly without thinking about it too much. So let's say that we have, foo. Why not, right? And it has some function, we'll call it bar. We'll call this Baz, and we'll give it a value of 3. Right? So let's just say that when we call bar, we're going to console.log this.baz. Right? So we've got this object here called foo. Right? Foo is this object. When I'm holding on to foo and I call bar, right? This is going to point to the object that I have. So if I went to run this and I said foo.bar, call that method, put my console up here, right? It would give me the number 3. Okay? Seems reasonable, right? Now, when you end up using call and you end up using apply, you do something like this. I say X, and I'm going to give X a value, a Baz value of 7. Okay? So X is just some object that's sitting out there that has a value of 7. And if I went over here and I said, hey, look, what I want to do is I want to call bar, but I want the context of when I call bar to not be this object here. I want it to be this object here, right? That's what that allows you to do. So you could say foo dot, I'm going to call bar, but I'm not going to call it yet. I'm going to call it, and I'm going to pass in the context of X. So let's clear this, right? That ends up giving me 7, okay? So what you're doing there is you're controlling the context. Again, when you sort of think about it, when you think about those methods, just think about them as just being methods, right? And you have the ability to control the context on those methods, okay? So let's just give another thing we could do here, right? We could also do apply. Same exact thing, okay? What's the difference between apply and call?
One take an array and the other one just takes.
Yeah, objects. So I always remember that with apply is array, A. I forgot it, never remembered it for years, finally came up with that mnemonic, or maybe I read it somewhere and I haven't forgotten it since.
Apply takes an array.
Yeah.
Aside from taking the array versus an object, like functionally, is there a difference in what the result is?
No. Well, I mean, let's use it. Okay, so let's say that we're going to pass to this. Let's pass a number, and let's actually do console this.baz times whatever number we pass in. All right, if we do this, let's actually get my console clear. It's actually interesting. You know, you've been through all these different frameworks that are using all these things. When you go back to something fairly basic like this, yeah, it's there, but you just got to pull it out a little bit, right? It's a little bit refreshing, really, because you're looking at just the native parts of the language. And again, you can do these examples really, pretty easily. I would even say, if you have some functional examples, you want to pop up JSBin, that could also help, straightening some things out if you wanted to. So if I said console dot clear, let me do that. So this is not a number, but if I went over here and I did apply, okay, I pass in 5, okay, I still get I have a problem here because I said apply, I've got to pass this in as an array. And what this will end up doing is that this will basically unwrap the array and pass it in as parameters to this method, right? As opposed to if I wanted to do call, I could pass in 5 and I get 35, right? So again, this is something when you want to sort of control the context, you could do it. Let's actually just think about this for a second.
Right,
What-
so hold on just a second.
Mhm.
So on apply, you're sending in 2 parameters. X is the first.
Right, apply is always only 2 parameters. Call could be any number of parameters. So, if I did this, it's a good question, John. If I did this, if I did AB and I multiplied it by A and B.
Mhm.
So if I was going to do this, it would be, 5 and 5, and here would be 5 and 5. Okay?
So on bar, the first parameter, the input parameter is
Yeah.
A, and in this case,
Let's do
it
3.
would be X in each of those cases.
Yeah, the thing is, I mean, the X, what the X is doing is controlling the context. The X is controlling, by the way, if you don't use this inside that method, totally irrelevant. Irrelevant, doesn't matter. It's only that within that method, if you're using the word this. If the word this is in that method, the question is, what is this pointing to?
So the first parameter I apply is, here's the context.
Here's the context, that's right. That's right.
Here's the context, and then now we're inside of the function bar. And 5 and 3. Let me just see.
right? So one of them, what'll
So
happen is that
7 times 5 times 3, okay.
yeah, the function will get called. The question is how the parameters get passed to the function. Okay. Let's just think about another few things here. Let's also take the example of,
So if you're gonna write down, like in my notes I have, apply takes an array. Call just takes, you just put a comma and just keep adding more and more parameters? Or does it also handle an object?
well, no, I mean, what's gonna happen is it's gonna look at these parameters,
Yeah.
and the number 5 will get, this function will end up getting called with 5 getting passed to A and 3 getting passed to B. If you had a C here, right, C is gonna have a value of undefined,
Yeah.
unless I end up passing a value to it. Okay? Let's, along the same vein as this, let's just say for kicks, let's make it a little bit more complicated. Let's say that what we want to do is actually kind of a good example. All right. Let's say that what we really want to do is that we want to pass any number of parameters at all. So, and we're just going to multiply out by BAS, and that's what we want our result to be. So we want to be able to do something like this. 5, 3, 4, 2. Okay? Nothing's going to break there, but those parameters just
They just get ignored.
get ignored. How can I get at those parameters? So if I wanted to see those parameters, let's actually comment this line out. All coming back, right, guys?
Old school stuff.
This is old school, that's right. So if I wanted to do this, console.log arguments. All right? Now, this surely feels like what? An array, right? But it ain't, right? It's close to being an array, but it's not really an array. In other words, if I said arguments dot for each, right, it's undefined.
And you can't put that length on it either.
I think length will work.
That might be one of the few.
I think length does work. Okay, so you could, if, by the way, if you didn't want to turn this into an array, right, there's a cute way to do it, which you should use because it's cute. But there's another way to do it. I could just do something like this. I could say for var I equals 0, I less than arguments dot length I plus plus. And every time I end up going through here, I could say, let me get rid of this HTML. This is smaller. Get rid of my output. Okay. And I could do something like that, and I could go in here, and I could say every time that I go in here, I'll say array.push arguments I. Right? In which case, if I said console.log ARR for each, it'll give me that for each function. It's fine. I could do that. Okay. Let's also just let's actually get this to work the way that we kind of want it to work. So we want to create an array, and what we'll end up doing here is we're going to loop over our array. This is actually a little bit of code, but a lot that's going on here. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to, let's now assume that I'm going to get my array. And, in this case, I could take this A, B, and C out of here if I want. I'm not even using them, but we'll just keep them there for a minute anyway. And I'm going to say, here's my result. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say array for each function. Each of these is going to be an item. Right? And I'll say result equals item times result. And so now if I do console.log BAS times result, Again, not a number. Let's see y, item times result. Let me start off with 1 here. All right. So basically looping over this stuff, right? Baz start is 7, right? So this is going to be going to be 7 times 5 times 3 times 4 times 2. Does that work out to that?
That's right.
Is that right?
Yeah.
All right. Seems like it could be smaller, but who the hell knows? Okay. So in any event, a couple of points that I want to make here. First of all, if you were using the for each, just out of curiosity, right? If I'm using the for each and I want to say console.log, and I want to look at what Baz is, this.baz, undefined, okay? So in the for each, the context changes, right? It's very important. You know, when you have a function, when you have something like a for each, which is functional programming, you don't control the context, right? Or you do control the context, but you don't initially control the context. Or actually, this is going to be pointing, I think it's just going to point to the global object. It's going to be the window object. Probably see a whole bunch of stuff showing up here. Yeah. Could barely even display. Now, if you wanted to do that, right, there's 2 different ways to do that, right? We could do sort of a hacky way and say that equals this,
Yeah.
right? And console log that dot as, and that'll work. Or another way that you could do this is that the for each, I think this is the case, don't quote me on it. We wanted to do this, we wanted this to work, I think we can pass a second parameter, I think, called this.
Setting the context.
I'm setting the context to it, right? So it gives you the ability to do that. There's other ways to get the same result using map, reduce, that sort of thing. But let's just think of one other way that we might, and let's try to pull all these things together. Let's think of one other way that we could actually get our arguments into an array, which is a little bit cuter, which is to basically say, okay, array, I know that you have a prototype method, okay? And I know your prototype method is slice, okay? Which pulls out, will actually work on an array, or will also work on something that's array-like, okay? And what I want to do is I want to use this slice method, and I want to call it, okay? And I want to call it on my arguments, okay? So the context I want to be my arguments, okay? I want you to slice, but what you're going to be slicing is, I'm array-like, so it'll work. I'm your arguments, okay? You're going to slice from here, and you're going to start off the second parameter, your arguments. The thing that you pass to slice, if you pass in 0 to slice, it'll basically grab everything in the collection, okay? So if you do that,
I don't think you need to pass a second argument to do that.
it's possible. If we do that, and see if it screws me up here. So if I did that, I could get rid of this, get rid of this. If that's working, right, I should get the same results. Let's just change our number just so we know it's working. Right? So, and you think I don't need this second argument?
Yeah, you don't need it.
If you don't pass in anything, I guess it does the same thing. Again, if you did have arguments that you were passing there, right? If we were going to do it, let's just say, just for the sake of argument, apply. And if we passed in 0, right, that should still end up working. What if we just, we'll change things around. If we start off at 1, we should get different values, which we do. right? We're basically just taking part of the array. So this is kind of the cute way, if you want to basically turn your arguments into an array, you could do that by using the prototype and calling it so it's operating on our collection. That's, again, you don't have to do it that way, but that's one way to sort of deal with that. So be aware of that stuff, the difference between call and apply, to be able to sort of control the context there. What are some of the other things that I wanted to take a look at? Other things that you've seen, you know, things like having second order functions, right? So sort of kind of a very simple example. Yeah, so here, let's take, we're going to have some function called fn. And let's say that this is going to, we're going to pass into fn, fn1 and fn2. And when we call this function, we're going to call fn1 plus fn2. Right, so we'll pass two functions in here. So let's say we have x equals a function, return 5, y is a function, return 6, and we'll say that z is a function, which is going to be fn x y, right? We haven't called the function, but we've created a new function. But when we go and call that, console.log, and we'll call z, excuse me, z is not a function. Oh, I think what I really want to do is this. I want to return a function. And when I call that function, I'm going to call return fn1 plus fn2. That's kind of what I was looking to do. And so basically, when that ends up getting called, right, that'll call these two other functions. So what you're looking at there, you know, again, something even as simplistic as that, what you're sort of looking at is the idea that you have closure. You know, fn1 is not being used immediately. It's being used later on. But you return this function, and this function is aware of fn1 and is aware of fn2. So that's one thing that I wanted to take a look at. Again, that you should be sort of familiar with. And you know, just to sort of beat a dead horse a little bit, let's just say for the sake of argument, we were passing multiple functions in here. I'm trying to even think of how to do that. So here, let's turn our fn's equals, and we'll say array.prototype.slice.call arguments. Now we're going to have an array. And what we could do here, and when we go to return this,
You could do a reduce.
sure. So we could do a reduce, and we could say this is just going to be a sum, right? Where we're adding things up. So we could say return, and let's do this one step at a time. Let's actually just make sure we're getting this part right. All right, so those are my two functions. And so then when we go and call this, we could use reduce and say fn's dot reduce. Reduce takes, I always put memo here. We could call it sum if we wanted to. And a function, you have to remember with reduce, takes a second parameter, which is sort of your seed value, starting value. So we'll start off with 0. And then we'll say memo plus equals, and we'll call this
You could do a return.
function, and then we're going to return the memo. Right? And we have to, yes, and we need to, this is our function, so we need to return this value. So again, this is just using reduce to do this, but again, the thing is that you can pass functions in. If you have a If you're not sure the number of arguments, you want it to basically, you don't want to have parameters for it. You don't want to pass in an array. It's another way that you can sort of handle this, but that's just not the way that we're writing this. And now if we call this, right, gives us that same thing. And if we stuffed it in there, it'll work. These are all, again, just sort of fun things to, I mean, forgetting about the assessment, just fun things to play around with, and pass in Q as well. Right. So again, I think that probably is going to be enough of what you need to know about that. The other thing that I just wanted to do real quick is a recursive function. And again, I always sort of think about the thinking about the end case, and I always like to think of a very sort of simplistic example. So, you know, when we talk about factorial, if we're going to write a factorial function, so let's go over here, and we'll say function factorial. I'm going to pass in some number, right? So we know that what we expect, right, is console.log factorial of 3. We expect it to be, right, 3 times 2 times 1. So this gives us undefined. What we could do is do our end case, and we could say, hey, look, if n equals 0 or n equals 1, return 1. Okay? And otherwise, we're going to return n times factorial of n minus 1. Now, again, it always takes me a second to sort of think about, but let's take a simple example, right? We know that the factorial of 0 is going to be 1, right? We know that the factorial of 1 is going to be 1. So if we start off even simpler, let's take the factorial of 2. We go in here with the factorial of 2, and if we go in there with the factorial of 2, we're going to go in here. 2 is going to be here. And we say the factorial of 2 minus 1, which is going to be 1, right? So it's going to end up, it's going to go through, as it's going through the stack the first time, it's going to go through this stack a second time. The second time it goes through, it ends up just returning 1, okay? And so to some degree, you sort of have to trust, again, trust that recursion. If it works for 2, it's also going to work for 3, right? We know it worked for 2. So if we did 3, it would be 3 times factorial 2. We just went over the factorial of 2 works. So this is going to end up working as well. And so this will end up giving us 6, right? If we end up doing the factorial of, 9, right? Numbers end up getting pretty big. But again, the whole thing is, get your base case and, trust the recursion. So that's a pretty sort of simple one. Again, what you're doing here, and John, you remember we went over this with the B tree. Sometimes it takes a little while, and you go, oh, I see how it works with your, one example of your node. Well, yeah, all right. Well, if it worked for that simple node, right, it's going to work if you go one level up from the node. So, I mean, if it works with 2, then why wouldn't it work for 3? If it works with 3, why wouldn't it work for 4, right? Again, you're going to be going into the, you go into this call stack a lot more times, right? Console.log in new stack.
I think what
right?
people realize is that it's doing some stuff behind the scenes that I'm not really seeing when it starts popping it off the stack.
Yeah, I mean, it's controlling, it's keeping track of the stack, and that's why sometimes someone will give you an example of what's the problem with doing this, like an interview question. The problem is that you could get the same result by doing a for each loop, right, and keeping track of it when you wouldn't have, that wouldn't be a recursive solution, but sometimes a recursive solution because it has to keep track of the, now why am I totally blown, the context as it goes through these call stacks, you end up getting a Stack Overflow, which is how they got the site Stack Overflow. Right. Go on.
So, as a practical matter, regardless of the exam, I understand why you would use recursion in something like machine learning. But in terms of web development, do you ever actually use recursion if you're like in a production environment web development? It seems really risky to me, right? You screw it up, everything crashes.
Yeah, I mean, if you screw it up, you that. Or I've had. Look, I've done it on here. I've done many examples of recursion. I mean, it's incredibly annoying. Even in JSBin, you put an infinite loop in, and you're like dead in the water, and you got to go kill your process and stuff like that. It depends. I mean, you know, if there is a tree structure that you're working with, and you want to do something with that tree structure, then you're going to end up using recursion. I mean, for the most part, I think. And look, forget about client side wise. Sometimes server side, like I did something with Sequelize where we wanted to dynamically populate nested models, and we ended up doing it by passing in a string. And so we would sort of go one level down to get, we would sort of break that string up. We would use, really was recursion. I might have done it with a for each loop, but we would sort of go, you know, one level down and look at the next object, and one level down and look at the next object. So, but I think any time that you have a tree structure, you know, that's when you're going to end up using. And in this case, you know, Sequelize for sure is a tree structure because you have objects that reference, you know, collections where you have an object that references another object, reference another object, and it could end up, you know, going down and giving you that sort of structure. So that's, I think, when you would use it. If you think about it, that's kind of when we've been using it more than anything else. So that would be the motivation for it. I mean, like, you know, even if you were doing something, I'm sure that, you know, we're not interacting with the DOM that directly when we use Angular, but if we were, then we're probably going to do probably some sort of recursive loop, or at least some sort of loop, whether it's recursive or not.
John used that in his game.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it just went through and kept doing all the possibilities, and then when it was done with, he recursed through them and then calculated all the game possibilities.
Right.
Yeah, that's a tree too.
That makes sense in that case, you know, game development. I can see that.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Anyway, any other questions about this? I think that sort of gives you a review that I definitely wanted to do because, again, some of this stuff just would not have been on your mind as much, and I think you know it. I think you could probably even have figured it out, but
How much of these kind of questions are on the?
not too much.
No.
Do you need to write any tests on the test?
No, which always makes things a lot easier. You'll have time. I mean, you will have time. I will tell you this. There's so little code that you're actually going to be writing. That's the amazing thing about it. I mean, so look, there are, you know, go through, look at your files. There could be files set up that you don't have to create new files. And like I said, it's very, in the end, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if the entire amount of code that you wrote with all this stuff, I throw out a number, I don't know, it could be like 50 lines. I don't know, but it's not that much. You see what happens. I mean, you know, you a lot of times with this stuff, you end up going down a path that sort of screws you up, but you don't have to. I mean, it's not going to be all that, you know, all that. When you see yourself doing that, take a step back and say, you know, usually for every, you know, to get every test to pass is usually just a couple of lines of code to do that.
Seems like it's going to be the same difficulty as the
Yeah, I think it is. I think for sure the Angular, maybe even a little bit less so. And I think the routing stuff is, you know, you've seen that before. So that's similar. And this stuff is some stuff, you know, thrown to make sure, you know, you were staying awake when we were looking at the functional stuff.
Your your one page of notes there in Quiver, is that something you can send to us? Or is that too?
I don't think there's anything here that's. I mean, I could make a copy of it. I mean,
Yeah. Just that. You know,
Risky. It's really layers.
it is. Thank you. He's very funny. This guy. When you don't expect it, he gets you. Yeah, I don't care. I mean, this is. Trying to think the best way to send it.
Because
You typed it in? Good. Do that.
okay, cool.
Even better.
The Fibonacci stuff, because we've done it so many times, or at least I've done it so many times, but I can type.
Yeah, I know. By the way, I always look at that and I'm like, I get very confused. But again, whenever you're doing the recursion, think of simple structure, 2 levels, right? Think of 1 level, add another level in, see what you had to do it. And then really what it ends up coming down to is, again, that whole idea of, work with this, then trust it. That's why I think that's a great example to do it with. But that'll work for anything. I mean, even if you with a tree structure, that'll work the same way if you want to collect all the children or whatever. All right, I'm going to stop this